hope this finds you well and that you had a nice weekend. You had a nice long weekend, actually. You were assigned to read chapters 1 through 9. Fingers crossed you did that. Here's our schedule for this week. So, hold on, technical error. Okay, so I have some slides for you, which is actually this PowerPoint that I am going to make available to you, which I think will be helpful. There is an optional online discussion. You've read the first 9 chapters. They're all very short. I'm curious, what questions you have. So if you have any questions, you can throw those at me. That discussion will close Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. So just be aware of that. Then you'll be doing the SR worksheet, which is not due until May 12th. And then you'll be reading and completing the study guide. So that's really what you're going to be doing this entire week, is just reading and working on that study guide. Towards the end of the week, there's going to be another comma quiz. I know some people missed the comma quiz and some people didn't do so well. So I'm going to give you another opportunity to improve your scores. Everyone's welcome to take it. And if you don't, I'll just use the first score from the first quiz. Okay, so one question that we are frequently asked is, why is Pride and Prejudice so hard? Which we also say is good for you. Okay, so here's the thing. A lot of students say, I just can't get into the book. And usually when I ask them, what page are you on, they're towards the beginning of the book. Please, again, you have to make every effort to get into the story. It's like deciding you don't like a movie after watching 30 seconds of it. If you finish reading the book and you're like, I hated this book, that is valid, but you have to actually read it. Give it a chance, okay? It's so confusing. Yes, I understand that. There are no attributions. There's no he said or she said. So we have to read very closely the conversations that are going on. And, this means, unfortunately, that we can't multitask while we do this. So, don't check social media, listen to music, that sort of thing. You really need to focus so that you're understanding what and who is talking and what's going on. Austen uses big words. Yes, she does. Some of the words are strange to us. Certainly today, we don't always use extensive vocabulary. This is a great way to learn new words. So look those words up. I'll put a glossary online for you. Use that. Use a dictionary. Use your phone. Check those out. And I think that will really help you, especially if you're looking to take the ACT, that sort of thing, next year. I can't figure out what they're saying sometimes. So along with tracking who's speaking, we have to sort of stop and ask ourselves, what the heck are they saying? So this is mini translations. It's deep processing. It's high level processing. I don't understand the time period. Okay, so we didn't do the speech to inform, but I gave you all sorts of background information and the FYI information. That's why I gave you that, so that you could understand the times a little bit better. And seeing the movie obviously will help. I will try to find clips and put those on there. I certainly encourage you to do that. Just know this book is about people falling in love. And people act the same when they're in love, whether it's the 1800s or 2020. So keep that in mind. People like each other, and they're a little worried about what the other person thinks. Okay, strategic reading 1 is also listed in your assignment, and this really helps you to get to know the characters well. We also do something similar in the reading guide. So if you're doing both, you should ace that first quiz. And the first quiz is not until chapter 23, after we've read chapter 23. So making use of these materials will help you. Okay, quick review for what we've read so far. the first line in the story is sort of Austen's sense of humor. It's a universal truth. Let me get my book out here. Um, so it's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. So if you have a lot of money and you're single, guys, that obviously means that you want to get married, right? That certainly is the case with our characters. They feel that, a single man with fortune moves into the neighborhood, and he is viewed as, they say, the rightful property of someone or other of the daughters in the neighborhood. So we have this character, Mr. Bingley, who rents Netherfield, which is an estate in Hertfordshire, and our protagonist, Elizabeth Bennet, Lizzie to her family, she and her family live there. And so Mrs. Bennet hears the news that this young bachelor has moved into the area, and he thinks he needs to marry one of my daughters. Certainly one of them will appeal to him. So we learn a lot about the Bennet family, and we get to know them even more as the story progresses. We have Mrs. Bennet, the lovely Mrs. Bennet. So she talks about, again, what kind of man must be in want of a wife, a wealthy one, who just moved into the neighborhood, Mr. Bingley, and so this excites her. Remember, Mrs. Bennet's sole goal is to see her daughters married, and she wants them to marry well. So indeed you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not. So Mrs. Bennet says this to her husband, and this is again a sign of the times. Women were not to be forward, so they had to wait for their husbands to make an acquaintance before a single woman could talk to a single male. Their families had to know one another. So it wasn't like you see someone, you like them, you go talk to them. There had to be a formal introduction. A character who is so odd, a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice. That is Mr. Bennet, okay? And in chapter 2, we really see the family dynamics a little more. Mrs. Bennet is irritated because her husband refused to pay a visit to Mr. Bingley to introduce himself to the neighborhood. Mr. Bennet has a great sense of humor, and he likes to tease his wife. So he pretends he's not going to make the visit at all, and surprises all of the women in the Bennet household by saying that Mr. Bingley is going to come visit. And so now, according to Mrs. Bennet, one of the girls can marry him. So we get to know them a little bit more. Make sure you're reading this chapter carefully. There's a lot of sarcastic humor. In chapter 3, we have Mr. Bingley and his group of friends going to a ball, and everyone's very excited. Now, the balls were a way for single people to get to know one another, okay? And so this is the event of the season. And Mr. Darcy is there, and Mr. Darcy causes quite a stir. He's wealthy, very wealthy, more so than his friend Mr. Bingley. And Mr. Bingley, really endears himself to the community. He dances with everyone. He's a great conversationalist. He's friendly. He wants Mr. Darcy to dance as well, but Darcy insults Elizabeth and basically says he's not going to dance. And his behavior really turns people against him. A foil. So who is a foil for Mr. Darcy? That would certainly be Mr. Bingley. So Mr. Bingley is described as just what a young man ought to be: sensible, good-humored, lively. He has happy manners. People like him. People like Jane. Jane never sees anything bad in anyone. And then who thinks of themselves very highly, considering that, their father earned a living in trade. Remember, trade, if you get your money through your parents, that's acceptable. But people look down on unlike the Lucas family, simply because he's worked hard for his money. And that's like, oh, you worked hard for your money, we inherited ours. Very strange. Chapter 4, Elizabeth and Jane discuss the ball and the newcomers. Jane likes Mr. Bingley. Mr. Bingley's sisters are described as being very proud and conceited. And again, people just generally don't like Mr. Darcy. Okay, so chapter 5, we meet Charlotte Lucas, and Charlotte is Elizabeth's best friend, but she's considered almost an old maid because she's 27, and when you were 30, that was really too old to get married. So you were a spinster at the age of 30. Who says I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine? That was Elizabeth talking about Darcy when he said he wouldn't dance with her. And Mary Bennet is very interesting. I asked a question in the guide about vanity and pride. She says vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us. So Mary's kind of an interesting character because she is able to regurgitate what she reads, but expressing herself is something that she struggles with. All right. Lots of gossip with the Lucas family. They kind of go over the ball, and they talk again about like pride and vanity. That's really important. So again, make sure that you have read that closely. They go to dinner at the Lucas home, and Charlotte and Elizabeth talk about Jane's situation with Bingley, and Charlotte has like some different ideas about marriage, and that is important because Charlotte kind of serves as Elizabeth's foil, and basically Charlotte says, Jane needs to make it very clear that she likes Bingley, and she needs to secure an engagement as soon as possible. Elizabeth notices that Darcy sort of seems to be eavesdropping on their conversations. He even asks her to dance. She refuses. Miss Caroline Bingley approaches Darcy and starts to ridicule Elizabeth, but Darcy won't sort of partake. He is kind of interested in Elizabeth. So what I want you to do is, again, kind of look closely at, these questions about how Charlotte feels, about how Elizabeth feels, pay attention to that. And I think we've kind of talked a little bit about this. Mr. and Mrs. Phillips are related to Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Phillips is Mrs. Bennet's sister. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner are also related to the Bennet families. Mr. Gardiner is Mrs. Bennet's brother. So you want to kind of pay attention to that as well. And let's see, we have some information. I'll let you guys read through this. I'm going to make this presentation as well as the PowerPoint available to you. But basically, Jane is invited to lunch. She goes because she wants to attend, get to know the Bingleys better. But Mrs. Bennet refuses to give her the carriage. And she's like, if you go on horseback, because it's going to rain, you'll have to stay overnight. This is perfect. And so Jane does, but it does rain and Jane gets sick, and it's just a complete nightmare. So yeah, Mrs. Bennet is a piece of work. Okay. Chapter 8, pay attention to the conversation between Bingley and Darcy about what will materially lessen Jane and Elizabeth's chance of marrying wealthy men. They stay at Netherfield because Jane is sick. And again, Darcy treats Elizabeth with some kindness. The Bingleys, Mr. Bingley does, but Caroline Bingley does not treat Elizabeth very nicely. Mrs. Bennet shows up, is insulted by Mr. Darcy because she doesn't understand what he's saying. Lydia is a wild child, and she's basically ask Bingley, when are you throwing a ball? It's very embarrassing. So what I'd like you to do, make sure you're reading chapters 10 through 13, doing the study guide. If you have questions, let me know.